The long ship cut through the gray waters like a blade through silk, its dragon head carved with such fierce detail that Barbara Watson could swear she saw its wooden eyes tracking her movement across the deck. The wind whipped her dark hair against her face as she stood at the bow, her hands gripping the rails so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Behind her, the coast of her homeland grew smaller with each passing moment, taking with it everything she had ever known. Edward Hill stood at the stern, his massive frame silhouetted against the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Even from this distance, she could see the way his jaw was set, the rigid line of his shoulders that spoke of a man carrying burdens heavier than the iron weapons at his side. When he had appeared at her village 3 days ago, demanding tribute from Chief Kenneth Reed, Barbara had thought him just another Viking raider seeking gold and grain. She had been wrong about many things that day. The memory of Kenneth Reed's voice still echoed in her mind, cold and calculating as winter frost. "You will marry Gary Davis by the next full moon, or I will give you to the Vikings as tribute myself." The chief had spoken these words while sitting in his great hall, surrounded by his warriors, his eyes holding no warmth for the woman who had served his household faithfully since her father's death. Gary Davis had smiled then, a cruel twist of lips that made Barbara's stomach turn. She had known Gary since childhood, had watched him grow from a spoiled boy into a man who took what he wanted and cared nothing for the consequences. But Edward Hill had been watching too, his pale blue eyes missing nothing as the chief pronounced her fate. When Kenneth Reed had gestured toward her and declared she was available for the right price, something had shifted in the Viking's expression. Not the hunger she had expected, but something else entirely. Something that made her heart race for reasons she did not yet understand. Now, as the longship carried her away from everything familiar, Barbara found herself caught between terror and an emotion she could not name. The other Vikings on the ship treated Edward with a deference that went beyond mere respect. They called him Bloodaxe behind his back, though never where he could hear. She had learned this from listening to their conversations, picking up fragments of their language during the long hours at sea. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The ship lurched as it hit a larger wave, and Barbara stumbled, her legs still unsteady after days of sailing. Strong hands caught her before she could fall, and she looked up to find Edward Hill's face inches from her own. Up close, she could see the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a white line that spoke of battles survived. His eyes were the color of winter sky, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. "Careful," he said in her language, his accent thick but understandable. "The sea shows no mercy to the unwary." Barbara straightened, pulling away from his touch even as part of her wanted to lean into the warmth of his hands. "Neither do Vikings, from what I have heard." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "Perhaps, but I am not taking you as tribute." "Then why am I here?" The question burst from her before she could stop it, carried on weeks of fear and uncertainty. Edward was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully measured. "Because your chief would have given you to Gary Davis, and Gary Davis is the kind of man who breaks beautiful things simply because he can." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had known what her life would become as Gary's wife, had seen how he treated his servants, his animals, even his own kin. Kenneth Reed had been willing to condemn her to that fate for the sake of a political alliance, caring nothing for her wishes or her welfare. Yet this Viking, this stranger who should have been her enemy, had intervened. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of wind and waves. "Nothing you are not willing to give," Edward replied, and then he was walking away, leaving her alone with questions that multiplied like storm clouds on the horizon. The memory of how she had come to be on this ship unfolded in her mind like a tapestry being unwoven. 3 days ago, she had been kneading bread in Kenneth Reed's kitchen, flour dusting her hands and arms as she worked. The morning had been peaceful, ordinary, giving no hint of how drastically her life was about to change. She had been humming an old song her mother used to sing when the horns sounded from the watchtowers. Vikings. The word had spread through the village like wildfire, sending people scurrying to hide their valuables and secure their livestock. But these raiders had not come for plunder. They had come flying banners of parley, requesting an audience with the chief. Barbara had watched from the kitchen window as their longship approached the shore, its crew moving with the fluid precision of men accustomed to working together in dangerous waters. Edward Hill had been the first to step onto the beach, his presence commanding attention even among his own warriors. He wore mail that caught the sunlight like fish scales, and his sword hung at his side with the casual ease of a man who had drawn it in anger more times than he could count. But it was his face that had made Barbara's breath catch in her throat. Harsh and angular, marked by weather and war, yet possessing a strange magnetism that drew the eye and held it captive. The negotiations in Kenneth Reed's hall had been tense, conducted in a mixture of languages with much gesturing and careful diplomacy. Edward Hill sought safe passage through their waters, supplies for his crew, and information about rival Viking clans in the area. In exchange, he offered protection from raiders and a portion of any treasure his men might acquire in their travels. Kenneth Reed had been agreeable enough until Edward's gaze had fallen on Barbara as she served ale to the assembled men. She had felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch, had seen something kindle in those winter pale eyes. When the chief had noticed the Viking's interest, his entire demeanor had changed. "Ah, you have an eye for beauty," Kenneth had said with the oily charm he used when he sensed an opportunity for profit. "Barbara Watson has served my household well since her father's death. She is skilled in many domestic arts and still young enough to bear strong sons." Barbara had frozen in place, the pitcher of ale trembling in her hands. She had seen Kenneth Reed's calculating expression before, had learned to recognize it as the look of a man weighing the value of his possessions. But she had never thought he would consider her among them. Edward Hill had said nothing at first, merely studying her with those unsettling eyes. When he finally spoke, his words had been directed to the chief but somehow felt meant for her. "What price would you ask for such a treasure?" The haggling that followed had been conducted as if she were not even present, as if her feelings and desires were of no more consequence than those of a prize mare being sold at market. Kenneth Reed had started high, demanding gold and weapons and promises of future alliance. Edward had countered with offers that seemed generous to Barbara's untrained ear, though she could see the other Vikings shifting restlessly behind their leader. It was Gary Davis who had changed everything. He had been drinking heavily throughout the negotiations, his face growing redder with each cup of ale. When he finally lurched to his feet, his words had been slurred, but his intent crystal clear. "The woman is already promised to me," he had declared, swaying slightly as he glared at the Viking leader. Kenneth Reed gave his word before witnesses. "Find your own prize elsewhere, Northman." The silence that followed Gary's outburst had been deafening. Barbara had watched Edward Hill's expression shift from mild interest to something far more dangerous, like ice forming over deep water. When he spoke, his voice had been soft, almost conversational, but every man in the hall had felt the threat beneath his words. "Is this true?" Edward had asked Kenneth Reed, and the chief had found himself trapped between two dangerous men, each representing a different kind of threat to his authority. Kenneth had tried to salvage the situation with diplomatic words, speaking of honor and prior commitments, while his eyes darted between the Viking and Gary Davis. But Gary, emboldened by drink and his sense of ownership, had made a fatal error in judgment. "She is mine by right," he had snarled, reaching out to grab Barbara's arm with possessive fingers. "I will not have some foreign bong sniffing around what belongs to me." The sound of steel clearing leather had filled the hall as Edward Hill drew his sword in one fluid motion. The blade was beautiful and terrible, its edge gleaming with the promise of violence. Gary Davis had sobered instantly, his face going pale as he realized how badly he had miscalculated. "No man owns a woman against her will," Edward had said, his accent making the words sound like an ancient law being pronounced. "And no man calls me dog in his own hall without answering for it." What happened next had unfolded with dreamlike slowness. Gary had reached for his own weapon, his movements clumsy with drink and fear. Edward's sword had moved like lightning, the flat of the blade connecting with Gary's wrist with a sound like breaking wood. Gary's weapon had clattered to the floor as he cried out, clutching his injured arm. Kenneth Reed had risen from his chair, his own hand moving to his sword hilt, but the other Vikings had been ready. In the space of a heartbeat, The hall had been filled with the whisper of drawn steel, and the chief had found himself facing odds that even his pride could not overcome. "Choose," Edward had said to Barbara, his eyes never leaving Kenneth Reed's face. "Come with me freely, or stay and wed the man who would claim you like property. But choose quickly before blood is spilled in this hall." Barbara had looked around the room at the faces of men who had known her since childhood, men who had eaten at her table and accepted her service without thought. Not one of them had spoken in her defense. Not one had questioned Gary Davis's right to claim her or Kenneth Reed's authority to dispose of her as he saw fit. In that moment, she had understood that she had never been anything more than a commodity to them, valuable only for what she could provide. "I will come with you," she had said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Freely." The voyage that followed had been unlike anything Barbara had ever imagined. The Viking longship was a marvel of craftsmanship, built for speed and maneuverability in the treacherous northern waters. The crew worked with an efficiency born of long practice, each man knowing his role without need for orders or discussion. They treated her with a distant courtesy that surprised her, offering food and shelter without the leering attention she had expected. Edward Hill remained an enigma. He spoke to her rarely, but she often caught him watching her with those pale eyes, as if trying to solve some puzzle she presented. He had given her his own sleeping furs and taken to sleeping on the open deck, ignoring her protests that she could not accept such consideration from a man she barely knew. "You are under my protection," he had said when she tried to argue. "That means you sleep warm and dry while I am responsible for you." The concept of protection was foreign to Barbara's recent experience. Kenneth Reed had housed and fed her, but only as payment for her labor. Gary Davis had spoken of making her his wife, but only as a way of acquiring her services and securing his claim to her father's small holding. Neither man had ever considered what she might need or want beyond the basic necessities of survival. As the days passed, Barbara began to notice things about Edward Hill that contradicted everything she thought she knew about Viking raiders. He never raised his voice to his men, yet they obeyed him without question. He shared his own rations when supplies ran low, taking less so that others might have more. When one of the younger warriors fell ill with fever, Edward tended him personally, sitting up through the night to ensure the boy did not worsen. "Why do they call you Blood Axe?" she asked one evening as they sailed through waters so still they reflected the stars like scattered diamonds. Edward was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old grief. "Because I once killed 12 men with an axe to protect something precious to me. The name stuck, though the thing I fought to protect was lost anyway." "What was it?" Barbara asked softly. "My sister," Edward replied, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "She was taken by slavers when she was barely 16. By the time I found their camp, they had already sold her to traders heading east. I've followed the trail for 2 years, but she was gone, lost in the great slave markets of Constantinople, or dead. I never learned which." The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, as if the wound had never properly healed. Barbara found herself reaching out without thinking, her fingers touching his arm in a gesture of comfort. He looked down at her hand in surprise, and she started to pull away, but his own hand covered hers, holding it in place. "Is that why you helped me?" she asked. "Because of your sister?" "Perhaps," Edward admitted, "or perhaps because no woman should be forced to marry a man like Gary Davis. Or perhaps because when I looked at you, I saw something worth protecting." The honesty in his words took Barbara's breath away. She had grown accustomed to men who spoke in riddles and half-truths, who hid their intentions behind layers of political necessity. Edward Hill's directness was both refreshing and terrifying. As they sailed north toward Edward's homeland, Barbara learned more about the man who had taken her from everything she knew. He was the second son of a minor jarl, with no great inheritance to look forward to but considerable skill with weapons and tactics. He had earned his reputation through a series of successful raids and trading expeditions, building loyalty among his men through fair dealing and shared hardship. "What will happen to me when we reach your home?" Barbara asked one morning as they navigated through a maze of rocky islands. Edward considered the question with the same careful attention he gave to matters of navigation and weather. "That depends on what you want to happen," he said finally. You could return to your homeland if that is your wish. I would provide escort and supplies for the journey. And if I choose to stay, then you would be welcome in my hall for as long as you desired, Edward replied. As my guest, under my protection, with no obligations beyond those you choose to accept. The offer was more generous than Barbara had dared hope, yet something in Edward's tone suggested there was more he was not saying. She had begun to recognize the signs of his deeper thoughts, the slight tension around his eyes when he was wrestling with difficult emotions. That night, as the ship anchored in a sheltered cove, Barbara made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. She sought out Edward where he stood watch at the bow, his silhouette dark against the star-filled sky. I have been thinking about your offer, she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. Edward turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. And I do not wish to return to my homeland, Barbara said. There is nothing there for me now, but I also do not wish to be merely a guest in your hall, dependent on your charity and goodwill. What do you wish then? Edward asked, his voice carefully neutral. Barbara took a deep breath, gathering her courage for what she was about to say. I wish to be your wife, if you will have me, not because I have no other choice, and not because I am grateful for your protection, but because I have come to care for you in these weeks we have traveled together. Edward was silent for so long that Barbara began to fear she had misread the situation entirely. Perhaps his kindness had been nothing more than duty, his protection offered out of honor rather than affection. She was about to retreat, to take back her words and pretend they had never been spoken, when he stepped closer. You do not know what you are asking, Edward said, his voice rough with emotion. I am not an easy man to live with. I have enemies who would use you to hurt me. My life is one of constant travel and danger, with little comfort and less certainty. I know, Barbara replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. I have watched you these past weeks. I have seen how you treat your men, how you face danger, how you carry yourself when you think no one is looking. I am not asking for an easy life, Edward Hill. I am asking for a life with meaning, with a man I can respect and trust. Edward reached out then, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her cheek with surprising gentleness. You honor me with your offer, he said softly, but I need you to understand what acceptance would mean. In my culture, marriage is not just a joining of two people, but of their fates. If you become my wife, my enemies become yours, my battles become yours. My victories and defeats alike will touch your life. And if I become your wife, Barbara said, leaning into his touch, my loyalty becomes yours. My strength becomes yours. My love becomes yours for as long as we both shall live. The kiss that followed was unlike anything Barbara had ever experienced. It was gentle yet passionate, tender yet fierce, speaking of desires long held in check and promises yet to be made. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Barbara could see something new in Edward's eyes. Not just desire, though that was certainly present, but something deeper, something that looked very much like love. We will be wed when we reach my homeland, Edward said, his forehead resting against hers, with all the proper ceremonies and witnesses. But know this, Barbara Watson, from this moment forward, you are under my protection, not as my guest, but as my chosen woman. Any who would harm you will answer to me. The remainder of the voyage passed in a haze of anticipation and preparation. Edward's men, once they learned of the engagement, treated Barbara with a new level of respect that bordered on reverence. She learned that their leader had never shown serious interest in any woman before, had turned down several advantageous marriage proposals from prominent families. Her acceptance of his suit was seen as a great honor, not just to Edward, but to his entire crew. Matthew Garcia, Edward's second in command, took it upon himself to teach Barbara some of the customs she would need to know in her new homeland. He was a grizzled veteran with scars covering his arms and a surprisingly gentle manner when dealing with matters of etiquette and protocol. The Jarl's wife holds significant power in our society, he explained one afternoon as they sailed through waters that grew colder with each passing day. She manages the household, oversees the servants, and often speaks for her husband in matters of trade and diplomacy. It is not a role to be taken lightly. Barbara absorbed this information eagerly, determined to prove herself worthy of the trust Edward was placing in her. She had managed Kenneth Reed's household efficiently enough, but she suspected the responsibilities of a Jarl's wife would be far more complex and demanding. Paul Nguyen, the youngest member of the crew, regaled her with stories of Edward's exploits, painting a picture of a man who was both feared and respected throughout the northern lands. According to Paul, Edward had never lost a battle, had never broken his word, and had never failed to protect those under his care. He once fought a bear with nothing but a hunting knife to protect a child who had wandered too far from the village, Paul told her, his eyes bright with hero worship. The bear was twice his size and mad with hunger, but Edward never backed down. He still has the scars from its claws, but the child lived to grow up and have children of his own. These stories, along with her own observations, painted a picture of Edward Hill that was far removed from the savage raider she had initially feared. He was a complex man, capable of great violence when necessary, but also of surprising tenderness and compassion. The more she learned about him, the more certain she became that her decision to accept his proposal had been the right one. The first sight of Edward's homeland took Barbara's breath away. The coastline was rugged and dramatic, with towering cliffs and deep fjords that cut into the land like wounds made by giants. Snow-capped mountains rose in the distance, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds. It was a harsh landscape, unforgiving and beautiful in equal measure. The settlement itself was larger than Barbara had expected, with dozens of buildings clustered around a natural harbor. The largest structure was clearly Edward's Hall, its roof decorated with carved dragon heads, and its walls built from massive timbers that spoke of both wealth and permanence. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily tasks despite the late hour. Word of their arrival had preceded them, and a crowd had gathered at the docks to welcome their Jarl home. Barbara felt a moment of panic as she saw the curious faces turn toward her, wondering what these people would think of their leader's foreign bride. But Edward's hand found hers, squeezing gently in reassurance. "They will love you," he murmured in her ear. How could they not? The formal introduction ceremony took place that very evening in Edward's Great Hall. The building was even more impressive from the inside, with soaring beams and walls hung with tapestries that depicted great battles and legendary heroes. A massive hearth dominated one end of the hall, its fire casting dancing shadows across the assembled crowd. Edward stood before his people with Barbara at his side, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall as he announced their engagement. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with cheers and congratulations echoing from the rafters. Several of the older women came forward to welcome Barbara personally, offering advice and assistance in preparing for the wedding ceremony. Among them was Ruth Brown, Edward's elderly housekeeper, who had managed his domestic affairs since his mother's death. She was a formidable woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, but her manner toward Barbara was warm and welcoming. "It is about time that boy found himself a proper wife," Ruth declared, looking Barbara up and down with obvious approval. "This hall has been lacking a woman's touch for far too long. You will bring life back to these old walls." The wedding preparations began immediately, with the entire settlement throwing itself into the task with enthusiasm. Barbara found herself swept up in a whirlwind of fittings and consultations, learning about traditions and customs that would govern her new life. The ceremony itself would take place in 3 days, allowing time for distant relatives and allies to arrive for the celebration. Carol Baker, the settlement's most skilled seamstress, took charge of creating Barbara's wedding dress. It was to be a magnificent creation of blue silk imported from distant lands, embroidered with silver thread and patterns that told the story of Edward's lineage. The work was intricate and time-consuming, requiring the efforts of several women working around the clock. "Blue is the color of loyalty and faithfulness," Carol explained as she made final adjustments to the fit. "Silver represents the moon and the feminine divine. Together they mark you as a woman of power and wisdom, worthy to stand beside our Jarl." Barbara was deeply moved by the care and attention being lavished on her wedding preparations. These people barely knew her, yet they were treating her marriage to their leader as a cause for genuine celebration. It was a far cry from the cold calculation that had governed her previous engagement to Gary Davis. Edward himself was busy with his own preparations, meeting with advisors and allies who had come to witness the ceremony. Barbara caught glimpses of him throughout the busy days, always surrounded by serious-faced men discussing matters of trade and politics. But whenever their eyes met across a crowded room, he would smile, and she would feel that familiar flutter in her chest that spoke of deeper emotions stirring. On the morning of the wedding, Barbara woke before dawn, too nervous and excited to sleep. Ruth Brown arrived shortly after with a breakfast tray and a stern lecture about the importance of eating properly before such an important day. "You will need your strength," the older woman said, fussing over Barbara like a mother hen. "The ceremony is long, and the celebration afterward will last well into the night. I have seen too many brides faint from hunger and nerves to let you make the same mistake." The ceremony itself was unlike anything Barbara had ever witnessed. It took place outdoors, in a sacred grove that had been used for such purposes since time immemorial. Ancient stones carved with runic symbols formed a circle around the altar, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. The entire settlement had turned out for the occasion, along with visitors from neighboring communities who had come to witness their Jarl's marriage. Edward stood waiting at the altar, resplendent in his finest clothing. His tunic was made of rich burgundy wool, decorated with gold thread that caught the morning light. His sword hung at his side, its pommel gleaming with precious stones, and his cloak was fastened with a brooch that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. Barbara approached through the assembled crowd, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and nervousness. The blue silk dress rustled softly with each step, its silver embroidery catching the light like captured starlight. A crown of winter flowers had been woven into her hair, their white petals a stark contrast to the dark strands. The ceremony itself was conducted by an elderly priest named Kenneth Reed, who served as the settlement's spiritual leader. His voice was strong despite his advanced age, carrying easily across the gathered crowd as he spoke of the sacred bonds being forged between husband and wife. The words were in the old tongue, but their meaning was clear enough from the solemnity with which they were spoken. When it came time for the exchange of vows, Edward took Barbara's hands in his own, his pale eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. His words were simple but heartfelt, spoken in her own language so that she would understand every nuance of meaning. "I, Edward Hill, take you, Barbara Watson, to be my wife and companion. I promise to protect you with my life, to honor you with my actions, and to love you with all that I am. From this day forward, your joys are my joys, your sorrows are my sorrows, and your fate is bound to mine until death parts us." Barbara's own vows were equally simple and sincere, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I, Barbara Watson, take you, Edward Hill, to be my husband and companion. I promise to stand beside you in all things, to support you with my strength, and to love you with all that I am. From this day forward, your battles are my battles, your victories are my victories, and your fate is bound to mine until death parts us." The rings they exchanged were simple bands of silver, but they had been blessed by the priest and inscribed with runes that would bind their fates together according to the ancient customs. As Edward slipped the ring onto Barbara's finger, she felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before, as if a missing piece of herself had finally been found. The celebration that followed was magnificent, with feasting and dancing that continued long into the night. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and delicacies that had been prepared especially for the occasion. Ale and mead flowed freely, and the air was filled with music and laughter. Barbara found herself the center of attention, with well-wishers approaching throughout the evening to offer congratulations and gifts. Many of the women shared stories of their own marriages, offering advice and support that made her feel truly welcomed into the community. The men spoke respectfully of Edward's wisdom in choosing such a bride, their approval evident in their voices and expressions. As the evening wore on, Barbara began to feel overwhelmed by the attention and celebration. Edward, ever attentive to her needs, noticed her growing fatigue and quietly suggested they retire to their chambers. The suggestion was met with good-natured cheering from the assembled guests, who understood that the newly married couple deserved some privacy. Their chambers had been prepared with care, with fresh rushes on the floor and candles providing warm, flickering light. The great bed had been draped with the finest linens and furs, creating an intimate sanctuary within the larger hall. Barbara felt a moment of nervousness as she realized she was truly alone with her new husband for the first time since their wedding. Edward seemed to sense her uncertainty, his manner gentle and reassuring as he helped her remove the elaborate wedding crown from her hair. His fingers were surprisingly deft as he worked through the complex arrangement of flowers and ribbons, his touch sending shivers of awareness through her body. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, his hands framing her face as he looked into her eyes. "More than I ever thought possible," Barbara replied honestly. "When I woke up this morning, I could hardly believe this day was real. It seems like a dream, too wonderful to be true." Edward's smile was tender as he leaned down to kiss her forehead. "It is real, he murmured against her skin. "You are my wife now, Barbara Hill. Nothing will ever change that." The name sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with belonging. She was no longer Barbara Watson, the orphan servant dependent on others' charity. She was Barbara Hill, wife to a jarl, mistress of her own household, a woman with status and security she had never dared dream of possessing. Their wedding night was everything Barbara had hoped it would be, and more. Edward was a considerate lover, patient and gentle, despite the passion that burned between them. He took his time exploring her body, learning what brought her pleasure, ensuring that her first experience of physical intimacy was one of joy rather than duty. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the great bed with the fire crackling softly in the hearth, Barbara felt a contentment she had never known before. Edward's arms were strong around her, his breathing deep and even as he dozed. She studied his face in the firelight, memorizing every line and angle, still hardly able to believe that this remarkable man was now her husband. The weeks that followed their wedding were a period of adjustment and discovery for both of them. Barbara threw herself into learning the intricacies of managing Edward's household, working closely with Ruth Brown to understand the complex web of relationships and responsibilities that governed daily life in the settlement. The role of Jarl's wife was indeed as demanding as Matthew Garcia had warned her it would be. She found herself mediating disputes between servants, overseeing the preparation and storage of food for the long winter months, and managing the household finances with an attention to detail that would have impressed her former employer, Kenneth Reed. But it was more than just domestic management that occupied her time. As Edward's wife, she was expected to participate in the social and political life of the community. She attended councils where matters of trade and diplomacy were discussed, her opinions sought and valued by men who had initially been skeptical of their Jarl's foreign bride. Edward proved to be everything Barbara had hoped for in a husband and more. He consulted her on important decisions, valued her insights, and never made her feel that her contributions were less important because of her gender or foreign birth. He was patient with her mistakes as she learned the customs of her new homeland, and generous in his praise when she succeeded in mastering new skills. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection that grew stronger with familiarity. Edward shared stories of his childhood and adventures, painting vivid pictures of the world beyond their settlement. Barbara, in turn, told him about her life before their meeting, helping him understand the experiences that had shaped her into the woman she had become. One evening, as they sat together in their private chambers with the first snows of winter beginning to fall outside, Edward presented Barbara with a gift that took her breath away. It was a silver pendant in the shape of a raven, its eyes set with tiny sapphires that caught the candlelight like captured stars. "Ravens are sacred to Odin," Edward explained as he fastened the chain around her neck. "They are symbols of wisdom and protection, messengers between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. I had this made for you as a symbol of your place in my life and in our community." Barbara touched the pendant reverently, feeling the weight of its significance. "It is beautiful," she whispered, "but more than that, it is meaningful. Thank you." "There is something else," Edward said, his expression growing serious. "I have received word from traders who recently passed through your homeland, so Gary Davis is dead." Barbara felt the blood drained from her face at this unexpected news. "How?" she managed to ask. "He was killed in a tavern brawl 3 weeks after our departure," Edward replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Apparently he had been drinking heavily and picked a fight with the wrong man. The details are unclear, but the result is certain. Barbara was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. She felt no grief for Gary Davis, who had never been anything but a threat to her happiness and safety, but his death seemed to close a chapter of her life definitively, severing the last connection to the world she had left behind. "What of Kenneth Reed?" she asked. "Still alive and still chief, as far as I know," Edward said, "though his authority has been weakened by the loss of the alliance Gary's death represents. He may find himself facing challenges to his leadership in the coming months." Barbara nodded, understanding the political implications, even as she realized how little she cared about the fate of the man who had been willing to sell her to the highest bidder. Her life was here now, with Edward in the community that had welcomed her so warmly. Winter deepened around them, bringing long nights and fierce storms that kept the settlement isolated from the outside world. But rather than feeling trapped, Barbara found herself reveling in the enforced intimacy of the season. The Great Hall became the center of community life, with everyone gathering in the evenings to share meals, stories, and songs. Barbara discovered she had a talent for organizing these gatherings, creating an atmosphere of warmth and fellowship that drew praise from even the most reserved members of the community. She instituted new traditions, blending customs from her homeland with those of her adopted people, creating something unique and beautiful that belonged to both cultures. Edward watched these developments with obvious pride, his love for his wife evident to anyone who cared to look. He had found in Barbara not just a companion, but a true partner, someone who enhanced his leadership rather than merely supporting it. The settlement prospered under their joint guidance, becoming known throughout the region as a place of justice and hospitality. As spring approached, bringing with it the return of trading season and the possibility of new adventures, Barbara realized how completely her life had transformed. She was no longer the frightened woman who had stood on the deck of Edward's longship, uncertain of her fate. She had become someone stronger, more confident, secure in her place and her worth. The news came on a warm morning in late spring, delivered by a messenger who had ridden hard from the southern territories. A coalition of rival jarls was forming, united by their resentment of Edward's growing influence and their desire to claim his prosperous settlement for themselves. War was coming, and it would test everything Barbara and Edward had built together. Edward received the news with the calm acceptance of a man who had faced such challenges before. He immediately began preparations for the coming conflict, sending messages to his own allies and readying his warriors for battle. But this time he was not facing the threat alone. Barbara stood beside him as he addressed the assembled community, her presence a visible symbol of the stability and continuity he represented. When he spoke of the challenges ahead, his voice was steady and confident, inspiring courage in his followers and determination in his enemies. "We have built something precious here," Edward told the gathered crowd, "a community based on mutual respect and shared prosperity. There are those who would take that from us, who would destroy what we have created out of jealousy and greed, but we will not let them succeed." The preparation for war consumed the entire settlement, with every able-bodied person contributing to the effort. Barbara found herself coordinating supplies and communications, her organizational skills proving invaluable in managing the complex logistics of preparing for siege. But her most important contribution was the unwavering support she provided to Edward himself. As the pressure mounted and the weight of leadership grew heavier, she was there to listen to his concerns, to offer counsel when asked, and to provide the emotional anchor that kept him grounded in what truly mattered. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. The enemy coalition struck at dawn, their forces converging on the settlement from multiple directions in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the defenders before they could mount an effective resistance. But Edward had anticipated such tactics, and his preparations proved their worth. The settlement's defenses held against the initial assault, giving his warriors time to organize and counterattack. The battle raged throughout the morning, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. It was during the height of the fighting that Barbara faced her greatest test. A group of enemy warriors had broken through the outer defenses and were advancing on the Great Hall where the non-combatants had taken shelter. Edward was engaged elsewhere, leading the main defense, and there was no one else to stop the attackers from reaching their goal. Barbara made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the frightened woman who had once cowered before Gary Davis's threats. Taking up a sword from a fallen defender, she positioned herself at the hall's entrance and prepared to make her stand. The enemy warriors, expecting to face terrified civilians, were shocked to find their path blocked by the Jarl's wife, armed and determined. Their leader, a scarred veteran named Joyce Harris, laughed at what she saw as a futile gesture. "Stand aside, woman," Joyce snarled. "We have no quarrel with you. Give us the hall and its treasures, and you may live." "This is my home," Barbara replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "These are my people. You will not pass while I draw breath." The fight that followed was brief but vicious. Barbara was not a trained warrior, but desperation and determination made up for her lack of skill. She managed to wound two of the attackers before Joyce's sword found its mark, sending her crashing to the ground with blood flowing from a gash across her ribs. But her sacrifice had not been in vain. The delay she had provided allowed Edward and his warriors to arrive, their fury at seeing their Jarl's wife wounded, driving them to fight with unprecedented ferocity. The enemy force was annihilated. Their leader, Joyce Harris, falling beneath Edward's sword, he avenged the harm done to his beloved wife. The battle's outcome was decisive, with the enemy coalition shattered and their surviving leaders suing for peace. Edward's victory established his dominance in the region once and for all, ensuring the safety and prosperity of his settlement for generations to come. But for Edward, the greatest concern was not his political triumph, but the condition of his wounded wife. He carried Barbara to their chambers personally, his hands gentle, despite their trembling, as he helped the settlement's healer tend to her wounds. "You could have been killed," he whispered as the healer worked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why did you take such a risk?" Barbara looked up at him with eyes that held no regret, only love and determination. "Because this is my home now," she said simply. "These are my people. I could not stand by and watch them be destroyed." Edward's response was a kiss that spoke of gratitude, love, and promises for the future. When they broke apart, both were crying, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion that bound them together. Barbara's recovery was swift, aided by her natural resilience and the excellent care provided by the settlement's healers. Within a few weeks, she was back on her feet and resuming her duties as the Jarl's wife, though Edward remained protective and attentive to her needs. The story of her brave stand against the enemy warriors spread throughout the region, adding to her reputation and cementing her place in the community's heart. She was no longer seen as Edward's foreign bride, but as a true daughter of the North, worthy of the respect and admiration accorded to the greatest heroes. As summer turned to autumn and then to winter once again, Barbara reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this place. From the terrified woman who had been threatened with forced marriage to Gary Davis, she had become Barbara Hill, wife to a Jarl, protector of her people, and a figure of legend in her own right. Edward, too, had been transformed by their relationship. The lonely warrior who had once carried the weight of leadership alone now shared that burden with a partner who understood both its challenges and its rewards. Together, they had built something that would endure long after they were gone, a legacy of love, courage, and commitment to the welfare of others. Their love story had begun with a desperate choice made in a moment of crisis, but it had grown into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. They had found in each other not just companionship, but completion, two souls that had been searching for their missing half without even knowing it. As they sat together in their great hall on a cold winter evening, watching the fire dance in the hearth, while snow fell softly outside, Barbara marveled at the twist of fate that had brought them together. If Kenneth Reed had not tried to force her into marriage with Gary Davis, if Edward Hill had not been there to witness it, if she had not found the courage to accept his offer of protection, none of this would have been possible. "Do you ever regret it?" Edward asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. "Leaving everything you knew to come with me?" Barbara turned to look at him, this man who had become her anchor and her adventure, her safety and her challenge. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "You gave me the chance to become who I was meant to be. How could I regret that?" Edward smiled, the expression transforming his harsh features into something beautiful. "Then we are both blessed," he said, pulling her closer to his side, "for you gave me the same gift." Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, and the sea crashed against the rocky shore. But inside their hall, surrounded by the warmth of hearth and home, Barbara Hill felt only contentment. She had found her place in the world at last, not as someone's property or burden, but as a woman of worth and power in her own right. The future stretched ahead of them, full of unknown challenges and adventures. There would be more battles to fight, more decisions to make, more tests of their courage and commitment, but they would face them together, as partners and equals, bound by love and strengthened by shared purpose. Barbara Watson had been saved by a Viking who looked like sin on a longship. But Barbara Hill had saved herself, finding in the process a love that would echo through the ages and a strength that would never be broken. In choosing Edward Hill, she had chosen not just a husband, but a destiny, and it was a choice she would make again without hesitation, knowing now where it would lead. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its lonely song to the stars. But in the great hall of Edward Hill, there was only warmth, love, and the quiet satisfaction of two souls who had found their home in each other's hearts.